1 hour ago, the European project crossed a line it may never be able to walk back. Poland just did what no Eastern European nation has dared to do since joining the European Union. Warsaw publicly rejected a binding directive from Brussels, exposed the private coordination between Paris and Berlin, and announced a countermeasure so explosive that currency desks across London and New York immediately shifted into crisis mode. The zloty spiked, the euro wobbled, and inside the European Commission headquarters, emergency lights quite literally stayed on through the night. For years, Brussels believed Poland could be pressured into compliance the same way smaller economies had been pressured before. Threaten funding, freeze recovery grants, issue procedural warnings about rule of law violations, apply financial leverage until resistance collapses. That formula worked before. This time, it detonated. 72 hours ago, a sealed communication arrived in Warsaw marked urgent priority coordination. It was not a public directive. It was a pre-enforcement consultation paper drafted jointly by French and German economic advisors under the supervision of senior Commission officials. The title sounded harmless: Strategic Harmonization Mechanism for Industrial Transition. The content was anything but harmless. Buried inside 184 pages of regulatory language was a clause requiring member states to align defense procurement, energy infrastructure investment, and heavy industrial subsidies under a centralized EU oversight panel headquartered in Brussels, with operational committees rotating between Paris and Berlin. On paper, it was described as efficiency. In practice, it meant this: Poland would lose autonomous control over how it spends its own defense budget and how it structures its energy independence strategy. Poland currently spends over 4% of its GDP on defense, one of the highest rates in NATO. It has aggressively expanded its military capacity in response to regional security threats. It has diversified energy imports away from Russian supply lines and built LNG infrastructure designed to secure long-term sovereignty. The harmonization mechanism would cap independent procurement contracts unless approved by the oversight panel. It would require advanced disclosure of all major defense acquisitions. It would prioritize EU-coordinated industrial suppliers over bilateral agreements with external partners. Translation: Warsaw would need permission to defend itself the way it chooses. And the internal memo attached to the draft made the intention unmistakable. Poland was referred to repeatedly as a compliance risk variable requiring structural integration. Not partner, not ally. Compliance risk variable. When Polish intelligence intercepted additional correspondence between Berlin and Paris, discussing phased enforcement pressure through budgetary conditionality, the decision was made. The response would not be quiet. It would be public. At an emergency press conference in Warsaw, the Polish Prime Minister stood before a backdrop of national flags and declared that Poland would not surrender sovereign control of its defense and energy architecture to any supranational oversight panel dominated by larger economies. But that was only the opening move. He then revealed excerpts from the internal compliance risk communications. He read the phrase aloud. He displayed highlighted sections describing phased enforcement leverage through recovery fund disbursement delays. The room froze. European journalists understood instantly what had just happened. A private coordination effort between the EU's two largest powers had been dragged into the light. And then came the ultimatum. Poland announced a three-step countermeasure framework set to activate within 72 hours, unless the harmonization mechanism was formally withdrawn and the oversight structure dissolved. The first measure targeted the EU legislative pipeline. Poland declared it would block every pending regulatory package requiring unanimity approval, including the multi-year digital taxation structure and cross-border infrastructure financing expansion. Without unanimous consent, these initiatives stall indefinitely. That alone would paralyze billions in planned investment flows. The second measure targeted energy routing. Poland controls key transit corridors linking Baltic LNG imports and Eastern European distribution grids. It announced it would suspend coordination agreements under the European Energy Integration Charter, forcing renegotiation of routing permissions that Germany and France rely on for diversified supply strategies. Energy markets reacted within minutes. Futures pricing widened. Risk premiums expanded. The third measure triggered genuine shock across financial institutions. Poland declared it would initiate formal review of its participation in the European Stability Mechanism contribution framework. That review includes potential suspension of future capital injections pending institutional reform guarantees. In plain language, Warsaw signaled it could freeze financial participation in a mechanism designed to stabilize eurozone debt markets. That signal alone was enough. Bond spreads between core and peripheral eurozone nations began widening before European markets even closed. Because investors know what happens when structural solidarity fractures. It becomes contagion. Paris responded with outrage, labeling Poland's actions reckless obstructionism. Berlin attempted a more measured tone, emphasizing shared European values and collective security alignment. But neither capital denied the existence of the internal documents. They could not, because they were authentic. Inside Brussels, the Commission President convened what aides described as intensive coordination sessions. Translation: crisis containment. The fear was not merely Polish defiance. The fear was replication. Hungary signaled sympathy. Slovakia issued a statement emphasizing national autonomy in defense procurement. Baltic states quietly requested clarification on how harmonization thresholds would apply to them. A precedent was forming, and precedents spread. Financial markets do not wait for political resolution. They price instability immediately. The euro dipped against the dollar. Polish sovereign bond yields rose briefly before stabilizing as domestic institutional buyers stepped in. German industrial equities slid on concerns that coordinated defense consolidation plans might now stall indefinitely. Energy infrastructure stocks across southern Europe saw volatility spikes. Behind the scenes, European central bank analysts began scenario modeling for fragmentation risk. Not exit risk, fragmentation risk. There is a difference. Exit is departure. Fragmentation is dysfunction within membership. The latter is often more destabilizing because it is harder to quantify. The 72-hour clock continues ticking. Berlin faces a dilemma mirroring one faced by dominant powers throughout institutional history. Push forward and risk structural rupture. Pull back and signal diminished authority. Warsaw understands this dynamic perfectly. This is not an emotional outburst. It is calculated brinkmanship. Because Poland knows that energy corridors, defense procurement autonomy, and unanimity voting procedures give it leverage disproportionate to its GDP size. The broader European public is watching closely. Polling in Poland shows overwhelming support for the Prime Minister's stance. Even opposition parties, cautious about confrontation, are reluctant to frame sovereignty as negotiable. France is concerned about perception. Germany is concerned about precedent. Brussels is concerned about survival. Markets are concerned about speed. If the harmonization mechanism is withdrawn before the deadline, Berlin absorbs reputational damage but preserves institutional cohesion. If it is not withdrawn and Poland activates all three measures simultaneously, the eurozone faces its most significant internal shock since the debt crisis era. And here is the structural reality nobody in Brussels wants to articulate publicly. The European Union was designed on the assumption that economic integration would gradually override national strategic instincts. That assumption is now being tested in real time. Because when defense autonomy and energy sovereignty collide with centralized oversight, integration meets resistance. And resistance, when organized and publicly legitimized, spreads. The next 48 hours will determine whether this confrontation ends as negotiation or accelerates into institutional fracture. Every headline, every market tick, every emergency summit matters. Because this is no longer about one directive. It is about who ultimately decides the direction of Europe. National capitals, or centralized panels. When the deadline expires, we will have the answer. What happened in Warsaw was not an isolated press conference. It was the opening salvo in a structural confrontation that has been building for years beneath the surface of European politics. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes that this is not simply Poland versus Brussels. It is a clash between two competing visions of Europe's future. For over a decade, integration has accelerated under the pressure of crisis. Financial collapse led to banking union. Migration surges led to border coordination frameworks. Pandemic shock led to joint debt issuance. Energy instability led to centralized purchasing mechanisms. Every crisis justified deeper consolidation. Every consolidation reduced the margin of national discretion. At first, this process felt temporary. Emergency measures framed as exceptional tools. But temporary tools, once institutionalized, rarely disappear. They evolve. They expand. They normalize. Poland watched this evolution carefully. While Western European economies focused on regulatory harmonization and climate transition targets, Warsaw prioritized territorial security and energy independence. Russian aggression reshaped Polish strategic thinking long before it reshaped Berlin's. LNG terminals were built. Defense contracts were signed at unprecedented scale. Military modernization programs accelerated. From Warsaw's perspective, sovereignty was not ideological theater. It was survival policy. The harmonization mechanism threatened to place that survival policy under a supervisory architecture largely influenced by capitals geographically distant from the front lines. That is why the language inside the internal memo mattered so much. Compliance risk variable was not just a phrase. It was proof of mindset. And mindsets, once revealed, change negotiations permanently. Within hours of Poland's public rejection, diplomatic channels lit up across Europe. Baltic states sought clarification on whether defense spending thresholds would be subjected to similar review panels. Romania and Bulgaria quietly requested copies of the harmonization draft. The Czech government signaled it would oppose any framework limiting national procurement autonomy. This was the domino Berlin did not anticipate. The German calculation had been straightforward. Poland relies heavily on EU structural funds. Poland benefits from recovery grants. Financial leverage ensures cooperation. Present the mechanism as modernization. Absorb complaints. Adjust language. Move forward. But that calculation underestimated two things: domestic consensus and geopolitical timing. Domestic consensus in Poland is unusually firm on defense sovereignty. Across ideological lines, there is deep skepticism toward external oversight of security policy. The leaked language validated those instincts. It transformed technical disagreement into emotional unity. Geopolitical timing amplified everything. The security environment remains volatile. Eastern borders are tense. Military exercises across the region are routine. In that context, surrendering procurement autonomy appears reckless to voters. Markets sensed that the confrontation was not symbolic. It was structural. By the second trading day after the press conference, the euro had lost additional ground against the dollar. Not a collapse, but a visible tremor. European defense equities experienced volatility spikes as investors questioned coordinated procurement roadmaps. Energy infrastructure funds adjusted exposure to Eastern European corridors. The European Central Bank convened what insiders described as precautionary liquidity reviews. That phrase is deliberately calm. In practice, it means contingency planning for capital flight scenarios. Because once investors perceive fragmentation risk, liquidity can evaporate quickly. Berlin attempted to regain narrative control. Senior German officials gave interviews emphasizing that harmonization enhances collective strength. They framed oversight as coordination, not control. They suggested that language inside internal drafts had been taken out of context. But the context was public now. Warsaw doubled down. In a follow-up parliamentary session, the Prime Minister presented additional excerpts from communications referencing phased implementation via funding conditionality. He argued that this demonstrated intent to apply economic pressure if voluntary compliance failed. The chamber erupted in bipartisan applause. This is where the crisis shifted from negotiation to power contest. France stepped forward as potential mediator. Paris proposed a revised framework limiting oversight to transparency reporting rather than pre-approval authority. But Warsaw rejected partial cosmetic adjustments. The demand was clear: full withdrawal of centralized veto capacity over defense and energy budgets. Meanwhile, smaller member states began recalculating. If Poland succeeds in forcing structural retreat, it establishes precedent. If it fails and faces funding retaliation, others may hesitate to follow. Hungary issued a carefully worded statement supporting national sovereignty in strategic sectors. Slovakia emphasized that security spending must remain nationally determined. Even Italy, traditionally cautious in Eastern disputes, signaled that defense procurement autonomy is fundamental. The coalition effect was real, and Berlin's leverage was narrower than assumed. Germany's industrial model depends heavily on stable integration. Export strength relies on predictable regulatory alignment. A visible fracture within EU governance threatens investor confidence in long-term cohesion. That risk constrains Berlin's options: escalate and risk systemic instability, retreat and concede authority. Inside Brussels, Commission officials drafted compromise language, stripping veto authority while retaining reporting mechanisms. The hope was to preserve the appearance of harmonization without provoking further rebellion. But trust had been damaged. Poland demanded written guarantees limiting future attempts at central budgetary oversight in defense and energy domains. Bond markets reflected the tension. The spread between German bunds and Polish sovereign debt fluctuated sharply. Hedge funds increased short positions against the euro, betting on volatility rather than collapse. Energy markets added another layer. Poland's control of Baltic LNG routes and interconnector capacity grants it leverage not widely appreciated outside policy circles. Temporary suspension of coordination agreements would disrupt regional balancing mechanisms, increasing spot price volatility across Central Europe. Germany's industrial lobby groups began pressuring Berlin to resolve the standoff quickly. Energy uncertainty translates directly into production risk. Time became the critical variable. As the 72-hour deadline approached, diplomatic traffic intensified. Midnight calls between Berlin and Warsaw. Quiet outreach from Washington encouraging de-escalation. NATO officials concerned that intra-EU friction could complicate alliance coherence, because the implications extend beyond economics. If Eastern member states perceive centralized oversight as encroachment, defense coordination weakens, and weakened coordination invites external opportunism. That unspoken risk looms behind every conversation. Public opinion across Europe is divided. In Poland, support for resistance remains high. In Germany, voters are split between those favoring stronger integration and those wary of confrontation. In France, debate centers on strategic autonomy versus transatlantic alignment. The European Union has always balanced between integration and sovereignty. That balance is now visibly strained. If Berlin withdraws the mechanism, integration slows. National discretion reasserts itself. The Union remains intact, but less centralized. If Warsaw activates its countermeasures, legislative paralysis and energy disruption become immediate realities. Financial markets react violently. Political fault lines widen. There is no painless outcome, but there is clarity emerging. The assumption that economic leverage guarantees compliance has been challenged. The belief that harmonization can proceed without resistance has been punctured. The narrative of inevitable centralization has encountered organized pushback. And once pushback succeeds once, it becomes part of the institutional memory. Markets open again in hours. If no announcement emerges before the deadline, volatility will accelerate. Traders hate ambiguity. Bond spreads widen under uncertainty. Currency desks hedge aggressively. If a compromise is announced, relief rallies may follow. But the structural question remains unresolved. Who ultimately defines strategic policy within the Union? The answer will not come from a single press conference. It will emerge from this confrontation's resolution. Warsaw has forced the issue into the open. Berlin must decide whether dominance is worth destabilization. Brussels must decide whether cohesion requires flexibility. And Europe as a whole must confront the tension between unity and autonomy that has simmered beneath its institutions for decades. The next move will not just affect bond yields or pipeline routes. It will define the operating model of the European project in the decade ahead. The clock is still ticking.